Mr. Philip Glyde, I'm pleased to welcome from the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, where he is the Deputy Secretary and also holds the position of the Executive Director of the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics. Philip's bio is in the packet of information you have, and you'll see he's got an enormous wealth of experience working across various government sectors and dealing with resource management, and looking particularly at the moment in relation to animal welfare policy. And so we're very pleased to be able to welcome him here today to address animal welfare policy in the Australian agricultural sector. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be handy. 5 minutes to go. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. Thanks very much, Natalie, and good morning, everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and their elders past and present. I'm also very grateful for the invitation, and thanks very much to Macquarie University and the Tomorrow's Law Organising Committee and also the RSPCA for the invitation. I'm a big believer in disclosure and letting people know where people come from. There's no such thing as independence, so I thought it might be just a little bit handy to say why I'm here and where I'm coming from, so that might help you understand. I'm actually standing here with a fair bit of trepidation because I'm not a lawyer, and I checked through the panel on the plane last night and discovered that almost everyone else is. I tried to be, and I was all lined up at 17.5 to go to the Sydney University to study law, but I got distracted and ended up worrying about sustainability for industries. And at the time, of course, sustainability wasn't an issue, or animal welfare wasn't an issue of sustainability for industries. So I did a degree in natural resource management, and I've got a degree in economics, none of which really equipped me to talk to you today. And the bottom line is that for the last 32 years, I've basically done policy at a government level, mainly around the long-run sustainability of industries and how to work with industries, try and make sure that they continue to exist and meet the needs of society. I've only really been dealing with animal welfare issues for the last couple of years. And as I said, I come to this talk with some trepidation. On the personal front, I'm clearly personally appalled by any acts of animal abuse. I've had to witness a whole lot of footage, courtesy of Animals Australia and RSPCA in my time in this job, that have come to us, and from other sources as well. And I'm very distressed personally to see that sort of cruelty. And I think every sentient being should be. But look, the Australian government is really focused on it because the bottom line, any sort of animal abuse isn't acceptable. The other thing you have to understand is I serve the government of the day. So I've got my personal views, but really what I'm here to do is to describe government policy, government processes. So if the Labor Party, when it was elected in 2007, had stuck to its platform that it brought to the 2007 election, I would have been busy telling you what a great idea it had been to phase out live animal exports. But strangely enough, the government chose not to follow through on their platform, and it's very clear that live animal exports is a critical part of the Australian government's policy. I don't know where I sit in terms of Robert's models, but I feel as though I'm right in the thick of a wide range of people asserting their rights, whether it's the industry asserting its right to exist and to be able to follow the law and be able to operate untrammelled, or whether it's animal welfare groups asserting their right that we shouldn't be using animals in any form in order to achieve their objectives. Clearly, it's a complex, multifaceted public policy issue. It's a huge amount of different dimensions: scientific, economic, religious, regional, cultural dimensions. Government's roles to try and balance all that up, and that means that in my professional life, I never ever please anyone. And I'm sure I'm not going to please anyone here, whatever perspective you might come from. But it's certainly one of the most challenging issues I've dealt with. I've done a lot of environmental stuff, but I think I really wanted to do two things today. One is just to briefly explain what the government's role is, because whilst we're famous or infamous for what we've done recently in relation to live export regulation, we also do a lot of other things, and I wanted to touch on those. But also, I really wanted to float with you my belief that if we're after continuous improvement in animal welfare outcomes, as in outcomes on the ground, outcomes that are followed rather than nice legislation unenforced, then I think we need to think about doing things rather than just the law. I'll come back to that in a minute. My first obvious statement, though, is that we live in a federation. Like the RSPCA, we are a federated body, and animal health and welfare are the primary responsibilities of the state and territory governments. However, the Australian government is also active in the area of animal welfare policy and seeks to achieve better animal welfare outcomes, both domestically and internationally. There's many in the community who argue that we need to be a lot more active than we currently are. But we have legislation that does actually play us right into the game, and that is in terms of the export of animals. We have a lot of export control powers. It means we can directly influence animal welfare outcomes in Australian export abattoirs, as well as in the export of livestock through our development of export standards and the imposition of regulatory requirements on exporters. I'm not going to go into that in great detail. I'm sure there'll be possibly lots of questions about that later on, and I'm here for the panel discussion as well. And there are others in the program who will talk about our rolling out of the SCAS, Exporter Supply Chain Assurance System. But what I wanted to, we're also active in international forums, and we don't get a lot of publicity about that, but I think it is important to describe that, because that is also a function for the Commonwealth, which is sort of international relations more broadly. We're pretty active in the World Organisation for Animal Health, or the OIE, as it is more usually known by its French acronym. And in 2004, the OIE incorporated animal welfare into its terrestrial animal health code. It's primarily a body that was created to deal with making sure that we had common standards and approaches to animal health issues. But for the first time, it brought in animal welfare as an issue that it should follow. These guidelines have been criticised, but they nevertheless reflect the expertise of the global animal health community that developed them. The guidelines are trying to provide best practice guidance on the management of animals to encourage a level of global harmonisation in the field of animal welfare and health. They have to reflect the fact that the OIE is a global institution. It has many different countries in it, and they all come from very, very different perspectives, whether they're economic, religious or other. But the idea is to try and use the OIE to float all boats, that if we can make some changes to the OIE, if we can get animal welfare focused on internationally, we will also be improving animal welfare across the board. So we do that. We don't get a lot of recognition for that, but we try. This might sound a bit trite, but we are trying to work with our trading partners and work with neighbouring countries to try and improve animal welfare standards and practices. We have much higher standards and practices in this country than almost all of the countries that we export to. And we've been working with the OIE both in the global forums and regionally, and it's a little known fact that we sponsored in 2008 when it was endorsed, but we sponsored the development of a thing called RAWS, the Regional Animal Welfare Strategy for Asia, the Far East and Oceania, and that we do a fair bit of work in that space, trying to encourage others to lift their welfare standards. So that's one area that we work in that's not well known. The other area, which we are probably a bit more better known for, mainly for the lack of progress that sometimes happen, is that we do work with the rest of the Federation. We, particularly in relation to looking for national consistency in animal welfare regulation and animal health, we're pretty keen to resolve a lot of national animal welfare issues, particularly in partnership with the states, industry and community stakeholders. But we have to accept the fact that we do live in a federation, and strangely enough, not every jurisdiction in the federation will have the same view at the same time. And there are a lot of issues that have been on the national agenda for some time, whether it's ritual slaughter, mulesing of sheep, what have you. These are intractable long-term issues that our federated system has proven really not able to handle in a quick way. That doesn't mean that we don't care about animal welfare, and doesn't mean that we aren't the target of a lot of campaigns in relation to animal welfare. Minister Ludwig receives thousands of letters a year from the public calling for government action on welfare, for the Australian government to step in where it is perceived that state or local levels have failed. I know this because we answer all those letters. I also expect that state and territory ministers receive the same thing. It's really very clear in this issue, this is not just an animal welfare lobby issue, it's not just a bunch of passionate people exciting the social media. It's clear that the community cares, and governments at the federal level and the state level have to be interested and engaged in those issues. And there's a range of mechanisms that we use to try and deal with that. The overarching thing that we do, which again is probably not well known, certainly I was totally unaware of it before I started in the job, is that in 2004 the Ministerial Council for all primary industry ministers, and a lot of primary industry ministers around the Commonwealth are responsible for animal welfare, endorsed a thing called the Australian Animal Welfare Strategy, or AWS. It establishes a national framework. It was developed by the Commonwealth and then endorsed by the Commonwealth and the states. But it establishes a framework for trying to have continuous improvement in animal welfare. It helps us to identify our priorities, to coordinate stakeholder actions and improve consistency across all of the animal sectors. It's not just about production animals. There's 9 reference panels and only one of them deals with livestock. So this is an area which I must say I was a bit surprised to find when I came in, that we put $1 million a year into supporting AWS, and most of that money goes outside of the production space. Most of that goes into areas that traditionally the department hasn't had much of an involvement in. We've been doing it for the last 8 years, and we'll continue to do it. But part of the good thing about that strategy is that, and the thing that surprised me when I went along to my first meeting of a thing called the Australian Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, which has been established to implement and advise my minister on how to spend the money, how to take forward the animal welfare strategy, is that at the top level on that committee, Animals Australia sits alongside representatives from the farm sector, sits alongside representatives from the various sectors that use animals for a commercial purpose. And to me, I was really surprised to see that it is actually possible to get the warring parties into the same room talking, trying to deliver improvements. They don't agree. It's clear that Glenys Ogies is not necessarily going to agree with the people who represent the meat and livestock industries all the time, but they are agreed on the importance of trying to improve animal welfare outcomes. We really want to stress that there's this thing that's going on in the background that's got nothing to do with live animal exports, but is nevertheless making progress. And I guess it is a symbol for me that there is some hope that we can actually find a way through the current difficulties we're having. The second part of the governance structure and how we work is the impenetrable structure of ministerial committees that deals with animal welfare matters. As I said before, the primary industry ministers' peak body is a thing called SCOPI, the Standing Council on Primary Industries. And traditionally, the animal welfare issues have been dealt with in a subcommittee of that group. Where the action happens in an administrative sense is in the committee that sits below SCOPI, which is the CEO level, the heads of all the various departments of primary industry. And there's directly below that, earlier in the year, the ministers created an animal welfare committee, purely to try and take forward more quickly the work that the animal welfare groups have been doing for what seems like forever, but to try and deliver nationally consistent animal welfare standards and guidelines. Cattle and sheep are currently meant to be going to SCOPI in April of next year. They've been under development for a really long while, and I might come back to that if I've got time later on. But the whole idea, again, is to develop better animal welfare outcomes that are going to be implemented in the states and territories, and more importantly, are going to be capable of being picked up, enforced and used by the industry. It's a significant change from our practice. We've really, I think, ministers, perhaps on the back of the live export issue, but there's been a whole lot of other animal welfare incidents over the last 15 to 20 years, but ministers have really taken on board the need to accelerate the action on these. But strategies, coordinating committees between governments, all that legislation, all the passion that we get from the animal welfare groups isn't alone going to ensure that we have improved animal welfare outcomes. It's very much a shared responsibility. there is that role for government, but there's a role for industry in its broadest sense, and there's clearly a strong role for the community. The livestock production industry is a critical player, and it is well understood in the livestock production industry that poor animal welfare practices impacts the profitability of the industry, impacts the sustainability of the Australian producers, and cause a whole lot of grief in a commercial sense as well. We've seen losses of markets have occurred because of poor animal welfare practices. So we have retailers in England stopping buying Australian wool because they disagreed with the practice of mulesing. I guess the most recent example is when, to the dismay of the industry, the Australian government suspended livestock exports to Indonesia. Serious economic hardship for the livestock industry. Ongoing handbrake on the development of that industry. These are I better get a move on. Talking too much. These and the other industry partners are the ones that set the operating environment for the livestock industry. The other industry partners are groups like retailers. So we have Coles and Woolworths who seek to gain market advantage over one another. One of the ways in which they compete is on the credence value of what they do. So one of the credence values is good animal welfare practices. So Coles have a hormone-free campaign. The RSPCA has worked with the retailers to join the RSPCA approved farming scheme. I won't go into the details of it, but supermarkets are the biggest connection between farmers and consumers, and they are exerting a huge amount of influence on the behaviour of the livestock production industry, and there's a tremendous opportunity for incorrect signals to be sent in relation to that. It amazes me that the whole notion of animal welfare in the mind of the community for the poultry industry comes down to whether things are free range or not. And that's important, but there's a whole lot of other aspects to the animal welfare of poultry that go beyond that. But we've managed to reduce it to a very simple equation, and I'm not sure if that's necessarily sending all the right signals. Consumers play a pretty critical role in all of this. They want ethical practices. Everyone wants better ethical practices. But in most cases, most consumers aren't prepared to pay for it. They aren't prepared to pay for the significant costs involved in changing a livestock production system. Some will. My wife will always buy the most ethically produced eggs that she can find, but a lot of the evidence is that's about 10 to 15, 20% of the market. It's a relatively small part. A lot of people still buy on price. And so in coming to the questions that were raised by the previous speaker about a flow of money to be able to pay for enforcing legislation, often that it's got to come from somewhere. It's got to either come from the taxpayer or from the consumer. And so I think we need to think through how we use the desires of consumers, the desires of the retailers, the desires of industry to try and generate some of the income streams we need in order to regulate industry. So I guess the overall bottom line is that I wanted to stress was that the livestock industry is operating in a pretty complex environment, and law's not and it's one of the most complicated operating environments I've ever experienced, but law is only a relatively small part of that. I think we are trying to, at a federal level, partner with all of the players in this complex arrangement. We try to keep the lines of communication going. I have regular meetings with the Australian Livestock Exporters Council, with all of the livestock industries. Sometimes those meetings occur on the same day as my meetings with the RSPCA, Whisper and Animals Australia. The common thread in all of this is the government's not doing a good enough job. But we nevertheless continue to listen. And I think the message I really want to do is to say that the legal framework and its implementation is not enough if we're going to get better welfare outcomes. I think we've got to start to think, and what I get into trouble talking to the industry about, is the importance of maintaining that social licence to operate. And I'd like to also consider the interaction between that social licence to operate aspiration and the regulatory approach. Because to me, it's a clear need for the Australian livestock industry to be able to improve its performance to meet the rapidly changing expectations. They're not going to, at the moment, they're not being paid to do that. They have to get ahead of that, and that's a real challenge. They continue to operate within the law, and a certain section of the livestock industry thinks that's all they need to do. Operate within the law, the government will save us, it'll all be okay, they will protect us. But at the end of the day, the legitimacy of an industry and its sustainability is dependent upon society's expectations of its performance. What worries me if we get into overly regulatory approaches that we might begin to stifle the development of the industry. In the interest of time, I won't go through the history of how the livestock industry, strongly believing that it is improving animal welfare practices overseas through its own education programs, through its own work, continually runs up against an incident. The Cormo is probably the best example. The most recent incidents in Indonesia, examples of shock, horror, terrible practices exposed that then leads to another layer of regulatory approach going in. I have somewhere in the order of, depending on how it's going, but somewhere in the order of 30 to 50 people are required to administer the most recent changes we've made to SCAS. It's a huge regulatory burden we're imposing on the taxpayer, but also on industry. And that, in and of itself, will stifle the development of this social licence to operate, this conscience. And I think we really have to think through how we work collectively together to make that happen. Just a short example, when I was at university in the late 80s, and this is going to a totally different set of industries, we used to study complex natural resource conflicts. So the best one was the Jarrah forests in Western Australia. In those days, in the early 70s, the mining industry was the evil person. They were completely decimating the Jarrah forest in order to expose the bauxite underneath to process into aluminium. The good guys were the forest industries. They were a renewable industry. Mining was non-renewable. Fast forward to 1990, Alcoa, which is one of the major companies involved in the Jarrah forests, received a UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme Global 500 Roll of Honour Award. This normally goes to environmental activists that have worked their whole lives in creating great environmental outcomes. It was really unusual in the 90s for a mining company to get this. Why did they get that? They got well ahead of their regulatory responsibilities. They went way beyond what they needed to do in order to get that social licence to operate from the Australian community, from the people who are concerned about the Jarrah forests of WA. Contrast that to the Australian forest industries who are operating in the same region. Over the period of my time working in government, they've lost that social licence to operate. They haven't grown to the extent that the mining industry's grown. By the same token, they've never broken any of the laws, and we've not lost a single species to forestry in this country, where we've lost a hell of a lot to agriculture and urban development. The point was they followed all the rules, they did everything right, but they didn't maintain that social contract with the community. The mining industry can operate, they're both heavily regulated industries, it continues to operate under that strong regulatory framework, but it is ahead of the game. And I'm not saying that every mining industry is doing the right thing, but every mining company is doing the right thing, but it's an example where with cooperation, with understanding and with goodwill, you can actually get a better outcome than just doing the regulation. And I guess that's the point I'm really trying to stress here, that that in contemplating the legal framework around animal welfare, it's vital that you work with the industries involved. I think better outcomes can be achieved. Summary, I guess, would be that legislation is a necessary but not sufficient condition for continuous improvement of animal welfare. It's my belief that overly prescriptive legislation can stifle the development of these approaches in industry. So, my summary for those of you who got distracted about something I said or had to play with their mobile phones, this is a really complex issue. There's widely held and absolutely legitimately held views. And when I talk to the livestock exporters, when I talk to Animals Australia, you can agree. They come from entirely legitimate positions. These views are entrenched, they're strong. The other characteristic of this is how widely the responsibility for this is shared. It's everyone's responsibility, and sometimes it's no one's. The one thing that I think everyone can agree on is that we want to see continuous improvement in animal welfare outcomes. What we argue about is the rate of change, and what we argue about is the method for that change. I want to leave you with the belief that The federal government is actively involved nationally and internationally. We don't just approve livestock exports overseas. The regulatory framework will be a critical element to this, but alone it's not a sufficient. It's not sufficient in and of itself to deliver continuous improvement. Industry itself's got a huge load to bear in this. It has to ensure continuous improvement. It has to go beyond what the legal framework says if it's going to maintain that social licence to operate. And I've said a number of times, but if we get the legislative framework wrong, we can stifle that development. I think we've all got a role to play: governments, industry, NGOs, retailers, consumers. We're all in the journey together. It'd be great if we could work together. The committee that I mentioned earlier on is one way that is a small example of where we've been able to work together, albeit around a series of projects that cover the whole of the animal kingdom. But we're certainly very keen to try and look at and explore ways that we do that. DAF has come in numbers. I'm going to embarrass a couple of my colleagues now because I would encourage you to go up and talk to them. They're here for the whole day. But Kerry, and you have to stand up and turn around, and Jad and Joseph, can you please stand up as well? They all work in our animal welfare area. Some of them even have legal qualifications, so actually have some expertise in this area. So please approach them and please engage, because we do want to find a way forward in relation to this issue. Thanks very much for listening.
And Elizabeth, if I could invite you up to the front and we'll try, squeezing in behind the table, I'm afraid. But it would be good, I think, just to have a few questions before we break for morning tea. So if I could again just ask you to provide your name and, if relevant, your affiliation. Yes, in the front here. We just have a microphone coming for you.
Just with regard to what you were discussing about enforcement, I mean, you'd appreciate, obviously, why ourselves and the RSPCA elect to have inspectors to enforce the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act in New South Wales. It's very expensive for both organisations to do that, but under the current model, we see it as being important that there's obviously a priority in terms of allocating resources to cruelty cases, in the absence of allocating it to, for example, the police or council, who have a lot of conflicting interests and emphasis on their time. Do you see a different model that potentially works with regard to enforcement, and where those various acts sit within government that from your view, may work better in the current environment?
I think my concern is that at the moment we've got a debate that seems to be either approved charitable organisations and or departments of primary industry or their equivalent. And it seems to me we need to have a broader debate about that. I mean, I do have real concerns about a criminal law being enforced, I guess, by a private body for all sorts of issues about accountability and so on, and just the exercise of public power. But I mean, certainly the Animal Welfare League and the RSPCA have got tremendous expertise here, and I don't want to see that expertise wasted, but it seems to me we ought to be looking at some kind of... It comes back to Robert's point here. We've got to look at whether or not the state is going to take some sort of responsibility in this area. And if it's a matter of public policy, we're saying that animal protection is a really important issue, then we need to take responsibility for that at the level of government. And I don't think it's sufficient responsibility to say, okay, there's been a historical involvement of charitable organisations and, you know, it's a great photo op, you know, once a year to be handing over the cheque. And after all, you know, the community cares and they give them donations. I think we have to start bringing the debate back into the public realm and say, who is an appropriate body to be enforcing the criminal law with respect to such an important matter of public policy? And I think that's where we have to start looking at some kind of independent office, probably to be engaged in enforcement, I would say, as well as in some of those more general roles about advice and standard setting and so on. But I mean, there are legitimately different views about that.
Thank you. If I could go to the gentleman here who hasn't asked a question yet. There's a microphone coming from the back here.
Thanks. Question for Elizabeth. David Champion, Victorian DPI. as far as regulation, and not so much for cruelty legislation, but for the livestock standards and guidelines, do you see any scope for a co-regulatory approach with industry with the use of their quality assurance programs?
Look, I think there is scope, but first of all, I think we need to know more about what's happening. And I think we need to know that something is happening rather than a lot is being said about it. I mean, part of the problem for me is that I hear quite a lot of talk about industry and quality assurance, but I'm not sure what's actually happening on the ground. So I think we need to know what's happening on the ground. And I think part of the problem there is that, you know, you're from a primary industries agency. Part of the problem here is that I think there has become a kind of crisis of legitimacy. For people who do care about animal protection issues, it's difficult to know whether or not they're getting the full story and whose interests are being pursued. So I think this is part of the problem. If it was a matter of industry, quality assurance, which I think is important, but I think that needs to be hand in hand with some sort of independent regulatory agency so that people who are outside of industry can actually have some confidence that there is some kind of impartiality and independence in terms of what's actually being pursued. And then coupled with that, we need far more information available to the community about what's actually happening. And all members of the community, not just somebody with a professional interest in it. I'm not sure that answers your question.
Just a comment regarding gathering information under the OARS project. Part of that is to for each state to be able to capture information on a number of offences and non-compliance, etc., and pull that together. So that it's work in progress.
Okay. And one final question over at the back here.
Hi, my name is Seema Srivastava. I've got a question for you, Philip. I know that for those of us working in government, we're at the behest of our political masters, and so therefore I was interested in your comment that had the Labor Party said it was going to abolish the live export trade, you would have been here talking about that, but you're not. Well, what I'm interested in is, while you've got to work within the government's kind of, you know, the mandate of their framework, what kind of scenario planning, if any, do you do in terms of if one day a government might come on board that does have, you know, that platform? I mean, what kind of policy positions do you develop within the bureaucracy to present to, you know, this government if it changes its mind, or a future government?
It's a really good question, and it's one of the things that we do not just on this issue, but on a whole bunch of issues. So the biggest opportunity you have for putting forward alternative policies is in an incoming government brief, where you can provide your views about what might be the best way to implement a policy. There's also the opportunities, if there isn't, greater opportunities where there isn't a stated policy, and at that stage we can put forward a lot of views. I think most people who work in government would have the opportunity, be aware of the opportunity to put forward a whole range of views to your political masters. We advise they decide, and there's a hell of a lot of views about what might be that we might have within the bureaucracy about what's the best future for live animal exports. We have the freedom to provide those to ministers, but then ministers and governments decide what that policy is, and once that decision's taken, then we're in the business of extolling its virtues or making it happen. But yeah.
I just want to ask Philip a question. If I might just, I know with the development of the Australian Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines that are going to replace the Model Codes of Practice, with the first set of standards, the land transport of livestock standards, at least with the initial stage, the writing group, I understand there was no representative of any animal welfare or animal protection agency. Actually, at that level, it was only later with the standards reference group that you actually had some input from animal welfare representatives. With the further, with the process continuing and the other standards that are being developed, are any animal welfare representatives actually part of that initial stage of writing, or is that continuing to be dominated by industry and agricultural interests?
It's a really good question that goes to my point about having to try and walk this path together. My understanding, and Bidder might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that we're continuing down the same process for the sheep and cattle guidelines, but the Animal Welfare Committee at its first meeting decided we need to have another look at that process. The sheep and cattle guidelines have been underway for some time, so the logic is for them to continue, but we really need to have a look at that to make sure that we are actually getting fully informed information right in at those early stages. That's number one. Number two, we're very keen for the policy direction to be set before we start doing the writing, and I think it's important for the animal welfare groups to be involved at that stage as well. So there's a bit of complexity around the question, but the general principle I think is a good one. If we are going to genuinely walk together to solve this problem, then we do need to have everybody involved, and we need to have disclosure information so that everyone's got the same set of information, and over time my view would be that would lead to greater confidence in each other.
All right. Well, I'm conscious I'm cutting into everybody's morning tea time, and I'm probably not the only one who noticed the baking smells wafting through. So we should finish there, but please join me in thanking both Philip and Elizabeth for their presentations.